The Bavarian Alps were covered in a thick layer of mist on a cool morning in May 1945. An American private from the 44th Infantry Division stood guard on a winding mountain road. He watched as a large black sedan slowly descended from the fog toward his checkpoint. The vehicle stopped and a young man stepped out with a confident smile that seemed out of place in a war-torn country. He spoke excellent English and announced that he had invented the V-2 rocket. This was Magnus von Braun, and he was there to surrender his brother Wernher von Braun, along with the top scientists of the Third Reich, to the United States Army. The technology that these men possessed was unlike anything the Allied forces had ever seen before. Their rockets had terrorized London and Antwerp, causing destruction that fell from the sky without warning. The V-2 was the first long-range guided ballistic missile and the first artificial object to travel into space. American military intelligence knew that capturing this knowledge was vital for the future defense of the United States. They also knew that the Soviet Union was racing across Germany to seize the same mines and machines. If the Red Army captured the German rocket team, first the balance of power would shift dangerously toward the east, leaving the free world vulnerable to a new and terrifying threat. This high-stakes surrender marked the beginning of a covert operation that would define the Cold War. The United States government faced an impossible choice between justice and survival. On one hand, these scientists were integral to the Nazi war machine, and many were implicated in horrific war crimes involving slave labor. On the other hand, their unique expertise was considered essential for national security in an atomic age. The decision made in those chaotic days would launch the American space program, but it would also bury a dark secret that would not be fully unearthed for decades. The pursuit of scientific superiority was about to collide with moral accountability. The primary protagonist in this complex drama was Wernher von Braun. He was a brilliant aristocratic engineer with a charismatic personality that charmed American officers. He dreamed of space travel and exploring the cosmos, and he framed his work on the V-2 as a reluctant necessity of war. However, behind the charming facade lay a dedicated member of the Nazi Party and an officer in the SS. He had shaken hands with Himmler and accepted promotions within a regime that murdered millions. The Americans were captivated by his genius, but they had to willfully ignore the black uniform he had worn only weeks prior. President Harry Truman officially authorized the recruitment program in September 1946. However, he included a specific decree that no one who had been a member of the Nazi Party and more than a nominal participant in its activities should be allowed into the United States. This order presented a massive problem for the military intelligence officers. Most of the scientists they needed, including von Braun, were deeply embedded in the Nazi hierarchy. Following the order strictly would mean sending the best minds back to Germany, or worse, allowing them to fall into Soviet hands. To circumvent the presidential order, the Joint Intelligence Objectives Agency created a workaround that gave the operation its name. The files of the German scientists were reviewed by military intelligence. When a file contained incriminating evidence of Nazi activity, a paperclip was attached to the dossier. This signal indicated that the background information should be sanitized or altered. The agents rewrote the histories of these men, removing references to active Nazi Party membership and classifying them as victims of the regime rather than perpetrators. The paperclips secured their new identities and their passage to America. One of the most troubling figures recruited alongside von Braun was Arthur Rudolph. He was the operations director at the Mittelwerk factory where the V-2 rockets were assembled. Unlike the theoretical work done in laboratories, the production of these missiles took place in a hellish underground facility. Rudolph was known for his ruthless efficiency in managing the assembly lines. His file was full of damaging information regarding his enthusiastic support of the Nazi ideology. Yet the paperclip protocol cleansed his record. The United States Army decided that his knowledge of rocket manufacturing was worth more than the truth about his past actions. The reality of the Mittelwerk facility was a nightmare that the American intelligence community chose to overlook. Located deep inside the Kohnstein Mountain near Nordhausen, the factory was staffed by concentration camp prisoners from Dora Mittelbau. Thousands of starving men were forced to work in cold, damp tunnels without sunlight or fresh air. They were beaten, executed, and worked to death to build the weapons that von Braun designed. It is estimated that more people died building the V-2 rocket than were killed by its impact as a weapon. This was the blood-soaked foundation of the technology the Americans were so eager to acquire. Despite the atrocities associated with their work, the scientists were transported to the United States. In 1945, the first group arrived at Fort Bliss, Texas. They were housed in old wooden barracks and kept under surveillance. They called themselves prisoners of peace. The dry desert landscape was a stark contrast to the green forests of Germany. Here they began to rebuild the V-2 rockets using parts shipped from Europe. They worked alongside American soldiers, teaching them the intricacies of guidance systems and propulsion. The collaboration was awkward at first, but the shared language of engineering bridged the divide. At the White Sands Proving Ground in New Mexico, the team launched their reconstructed rockets. Each successful launch solidified their value to the United States Army. The spectacle of a V-2 roaring into the blue desert sky was a powerful demonstration of military might. As the rockets climbed higher, the memories of the slave laborers in the tunnels of Dora faded further into the background. The American government was focused on the future and the looming threat of the Soviet Union. The past was becoming a sealed file stored away in the vaults of the Pentagon. The tension of the Cold War escalated dramatically in 1949 when the Soviet Union detonated its first atomic bomb. The United States lost its nuclear monopoly, and panic spread through Washington. The need for a delivery system for nuclear warheads became the top priority. The German scientists were no longer just guests, they were a strategic asset. The restrictions on their movements were loosened, and they were encouraged to integrate into American society. The narrative shifted from them being former enemies to being essential partners in the defense of the free world against communism. In 1950, the team was moved to the Redstone Arsenal in Huntsville, Alabama. This town would become the birthplace of the American space program. The German engineers settled into the community, buying homes and joining civic organizations. Wernher von Braun became a local celebrity. He joined a church and spoke at Rotary clubs. He published articles in national magazines promoting the idea of space stations and trips to the moon. He was selling the American public on a vision of the future that was optimistic and exciting, carefully distancing himself from the destruction his inventions had caused in Europe. Arthur Rudolph also settled in Huntsville and continued his work as a project manager. He was instrumental in developing the Pershing missile and later the Saturn V rocket. He was regarded as a quiet and hardworking man by his neighbors. Few people asked questions about what he had done during the war. The community of Huntsville embraced the German families. They brought culture and music and scientific prestige to the town. The horrifying conditions of the Mittelwerk tunnels seemed like a lifetime away, a bad dream that had no place in the sunny suburbs of Alabama. By 1955, many of the Paperclip scientists were granted United States citizenship. Their sworn affidavits denied any war crimes, and the falsified records created by the military held up against scrutiny. They pledged allegiance to the flag of the United States and became fully naturalized Americans. This legal status offered them a final layer of protection. They were now citizens with rights, and the government that had brought them over was committed to protecting its investment. The operation was a complete success in terms of intelligence gathering and technology transfer. The shock of Sputnik in 1957 shattered American confidence. The Soviet Union had launched the first satellite into orbit, and the United States appeared to be falling behind. The public demanded an answer. The Navy attempted to launch a satellite with the Vanguard rocket, but it exploded on the launch pad in a humiliating failure. The government turned to von Braun and his team at the Redstone Arsenal. They had been waiting for this moment. In just 84 days, they successfully launched Explorer 1, putting America back in the race. The success of Explorer 1 made Wernher von Braun a national hero. He was featured on the cover of Time magazine and hailed as the savior of American prestige. The uncomfortable questions about his past were drowned out by the applause. He became the face of the space age, appearing on television with Walt Disney to explain the science of rockets to children. He was charismatic and visionary, perfectly casting himself as a man of science, dedicated to the betterment of mankind. The V-2 was no longer a weapon of terror, it was the grandfather of the spaceship. In 1958, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration was formed to consolidate the space exploration efforts. The German team was transferred to the new agency and became the core of the Marshall Space Flight Center. Von Braun was named the director, and Arthur Rudolph became the project director for the Saturn V program. These men were now high-ranking officials in the United States government. They commanded thousands of American employees and managed budgets worth billions of dollars. They were at the very pinnacle of their careers. President John F. Kennedy delivered his famous speech in 1961, challenging the nation to land a man on the moon before the decade was out. This goal required a rocket of immense power and complexity. The Saturn V was the engineering masterpiece that would make it possible. It stands as the tallest, heaviest, and most powerful rocket ever brought to operational status. Its design was a direct evolution of the work done by von Braun and Rudolph. The path to the moon was being paved by the same minds that had paved the path of destruction across London. The Apollo program moved forward with incredible speed. The pressure on the German team was immense, but they delivered time and again. They were driven by a desire to prove their worth and perhaps to redeem their legacy through peaceful exploration. Wernher von Braun managed the massive project with the same organizational skill he had used in Germany, but now with unlimited resources and voluntary labor. The Saturn V never failed in flight. It was a testament to their engineering prowess and the ultimate validation of Operation Paperclip. On July 16, 1969, the Saturn V launched Apollo 11 toward the moon. The world watched in awe as the massive rocket cleared the tower. 4 days later, Neil Armstrong took his historic small step. It was a triumph for the United States and for humanity. In the control room, Wernher von Braun watched with pride. He was carried on the shoulders of jubilant Americans. It was the crowning achievement of his life. At that moment, he was the most celebrated engineer in history, and his Nazi past seemed completely forgotten. However, the silence regarding the past would not last forever. As the 1970s progressed, the political climate in the United States began to change. The Watergate scandal created a new era of skepticism toward government secrecy. Investigative journalists and Nazi hunters began to dig into the archives. They found the discrepancies in the files of the Paperclip scientists. The stories of the survivors from the Dora Mittelbau camp began to circulate. The image of the kindly space pioneers began to crack, revealing the dark history underneath. In 1979, the Department of Justice created the Office of Special Investigations. Its sole purpose was to identify and deport former Nazis living in the United States. The attorneys at the OSI were not interested in the scientific contributions of these men. They were interested in justice. They began to review the original German records that had been ignored or hidden by the military. They found the membership cards, the SS officer ranks, and the reports from the slave labor camps. The paperclips were removed and the truth was exposed. Arthur Rudolph was one of the first high-profile targets of the OSI. In the early 1980s, investigators interviewed him about his role at Mittelwerk. Under oath, Rudolph admitted to requisitioning forced labor and witnessing the appalling conditions in the tunnels. The evidence was overwhelming. The man who had helped put Americans on the moon was undeniably linked to the persecution and death of thousands of prisoners. The Department of Justice threatened him with a trial that would strip him of his citizenship and pension. Faced with the prospect of a humiliating public trial, Arthur Rudolph signed an agreement with the Department of Justice in 1984. He agreed to renounce his United States citizenship and leave the country forever. In exchange, he would not be prosecuted. He returned to West Germany an old and embittered man. He maintained his innocence, claiming he was just following orders and had no choice. The controversy ignited a firestorm of debate. Many in Huntsville defended him, while survivors of the camps demanded justice. Wernher von Braun did not live to see the full unraveling of his team. He died of cancer in 1977. However, his legacy was heavily scrutinized after his death. Declassified documents revealed that he was more than just a scientist caught in a bad situation. He had been a member of the SS and had visited the Mittelwerk factory multiple times. He was aware of the slave labor and the brutal treatment of prisoners. The hero of the space race was revealed to be a man who had made a pact with the devil to achieve his dreams. The story of Operation Paperclip forces us to ask uncomfortable questions about morality and progress. The United States made a calculated decision to prioritize technological advantage over justice. Without the German scientists, the American space program would have been delayed by years, perhaps allowing the Soviet Union to dominate space. The moon landing might not have happened in 1969. But the cost of that achievement was the sanctuary given to men who were complicit in some of the worst crimes of the 20th century. Other figures from the operation also faced scrutiny. Hubertus Strughold, known as the father of space medicine, was linked to horrific human experiments at the Dachau concentration camp. He had been honored with a library named after him at an Air Force base, but his name was stripped away as the truth came out. The legacy of these men is a tangled web of brilliance and evil. They advanced human knowledge while standing on the graves of the innocent. It is a duality that history struggles to reconcile. Today, the Saturn V rocket still stands as a museum piece, a symbol of American ingenuity. But its shadow is long and dark. It serves as a reminder that the line between good and evil is often blurred by the pursuit of power. The men of Operation Paperclip were not monsters in the traditional sense. They were educated, cultured, and brilliant. Yet they served a monstrous regime and then served a democracy with equal efficiency. Their lives demonstrate how easily technical competence can be separated from moral responsibility. The ethical question remains unanswered. Does the end justify the means? Was the knowledge gained worth the compromise of moral principles? The United States defeated the Soviet Union in the race to the moon, but in doing so it compromised its own values. The recruitment of former Nazis remains a stain on the legacy of the Apollo program. It teaches us that scientific progress does not automatically equate to moral progress. We can reach the stars while still carrying the darkness of our past. As we look back at the history of the 20th century, Operation Paperclip stands as a warning. It reminds us that in times of fear and conflict, nations are willing to make deals that haunt them for generations. The legacy of Wernher von Braun and his team is not just the flags on the moon or the satellites in orbit. It is also the memory of the prisoners in the tunnels of Dora. We must remember both the triumph and the tragedy, ensuring that we never again sacrifice our humanity on the altar of advancement.